You're watching HuffPost Live. I'm Nancy Red, and I want to know, have you ever been judged for liking something that may not fit your perceived stereotype? Like, for example, if you're black and enjoy heavy metal music, fat and like to run, are you a man who loves to knit? Well, for these people and many more, they fall victim to having their favorite hobbies questioned because the activities they love don't seem to fit their supposed personality traits. So where do these stereotypes come from? And more importantly, how do they affect the people who don't look like they'd like that? Joining me to discuss, we have a fabulous panel. First and foremost, we have Lena Dawes, a music journalist, photographer, and author of What Are You Doing Here? A Black Woman's Life and Liberation in Heavy Metal. We also have Gregory Patrick, author of the book and blog Mad Man Knitting. Julie Creefield, she is a blogger at The Fat Girl's Guide to Running. And Dr. Douglas Martin, a social psychologist at the University of Aberdeen. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, as can be expected, people are in our comments feeling judged, feeling angry, feeling content, and feeling like, you know what, I don't care. We have Lena Bina right here. She says, I pretty much match my perceived stereotype. Kidding. I can't control what you prejudge about me. I just do what I do. Now, Dr. Martin, before we get to our wonderful, interesting, and technically atypical guests, I want you to talk to me a little bit about your research. Where do we even get stereotypes in the first place?
So that's something we've really been interested in, because the weird thing about stereotypes is that irrespective of an individual's level of prejudice, we all have similar levels of knowledge of content of cultural stereotypes. So if you take someone who was, say, openly racist and someone who was very non-racially prejudiced, they'd have equal knowledge about the content of stereotypes. So we've got this shared pool of knowledge irrespective of our own beliefs. And what we want to do is how do the bits of information become associated with social groups in the first place? So we ran a series of experiments which are a bit like the game often called Chinese Whispers in the UK or I think Telephone in the US. And essentially what we're interested in is if you give people random social information at the beginning of a chain and just ask them to try and learn that information and then test them on whatever they remember, and then if you pass on what they remember as the learning materials for the next person and sort of have that passing down a chain, what happens to that information? So what we find is, first of all, that lots of information is lost from the system, so lots of stuff is just forgotten. In addition to that, the information becomes categorically structured. So you find that even though there's no category structure to begin with, you end up with a situation that social targets who share physical features end up sharing personality characteristics that they didn't initially share. And as a consequence of the loss of information and the structure that builds up, what you find is that the information is much easier to pass from person to person. So essentially what you end up with by the end of a chain is you see individual physical characteristics are very strongly associated with certain personality characteristics, so that if you were to identify the physical characteristic, you could identify the personality characteristic.
So when we're talking about the physical characteristics, I think this is a great time to bring in one of our guests. We actually have another comment from Lena Bina right here. I had a coworker's husband get pulled over by cops because he had a cat in his lap while driving. They questioned him about why he had a cat, as opposed to not safely restraining the cat. Guys can't love cats, LOL. And I think we see that a lot. We, as a doctor was saying, we look at the physical idea of what we think a stereotype should be perceived as. Gregory, you're in that kind of situation. You are a man who loves knitting. And now many people can't quite get a handle on this.
Well, you know, sometimes they do. They actually find it kind of genuine and unique. They don't automatically look at me and go, well, that's kind of strange and unusual. A lot of people actually kind of go towards it and say, you know, that's actually pretty cool.
Well, they do think it's very cool. And one of the things that's cool is, how did you get into it in the first place?
Well, I had known about knitting for a long time. I had done it just as a hobby, but then I guess about 3 years ago, I ended up homeless and had to find a way to feed myself. So I actually picked up the needles and just started knitting whatever I could and started knitting teddy bears. And from that, I was able to find a place to live and food and an entire world of friends.
And it's something that if you had been worried about preconceived notions and stereotypes, you wouldn't have ended up being the mad knitting. You wouldn't be speaking to us today.
The funny thing is that I think it was because I looked the way that I did that I got a lot of attention in the knitting community because I didn't look like your stereotypical knitter. I guess that would mean someone who looks a little more polished and is a little older, maybe more feminine. But because I looked like this kind of redneck off in the corner knitting, people immediately took notice.
And they took notice mostly positively, buying your teddy bears, being supportive.
Mostly positively.
But not
Sometimes,
always. You actually wrote for us this piece, which we could not get over it, right here. Gregory Patrick, the time I was questioned by police for knitting in a Starbucks. What happened here?
Yeah. No, that was actually pretty cute. There was a stereotype on my end as well. I was viewing the cops as probably going to come up to harass me. But in all fairness, they didn't really do it in their official capacity. I really think that they were interested, let alone seeing a guy knit, but a guy knitting with 4 needles. And if you know anything about knitting, you know it's a little more complicated. No, at first they were kind of leery, but after that, they were actually very polite and kind and was like, when are you usually here? And I'm like 7 in the morning, and they're like, all right, if you never need any backup, just let us know. But it took a little coaxing to make them feel like I was okay. I was all right.
But that's just it. You had to work hard to make them feel okay with you and your knitting. And you have had people in the past, not necessarily be as positive or positively curious.
No, not always. There have been some, I try not to let them break me down or, make me feel in any way, any kind of negativity towards what I do or who I am. I make a habit of cutting those people out of my life completely the minute I see it happening. But, if someone doesn't want to get to know me just based on stereotypes, well, they'll never get to know my charm then, will they?
Exactly, and shame on them and too bad for them. When we're talking about stereotypes, they aren't necessarily harmful in and of themselves. We have a comment right here, though, from Studio Teresa. I'm a classically trained cellist and flautist. I'm a scientist. I rebuild computers and devices. I code my ass off. If you have to reconcile my lives and my loves, my abilities and my intellectual acumen with my being black and female and Southern, then that's your problem. And sometimes these stereotypes can and do fail us. It seems, especially when it comes to hobbies. Now, Gregory loves to knit. And Lena, you love heavy metal. You actually inspired this conversation when you reached out to me. You wrote the amazing book, What Are You Doing Here?, about being a black woman in the heavy metal world. Let's back up. First, you have to tell us how your love for heavy metal started.
It started like, everybody else, who gravitated towards heavy metal. I was a kid. I was 8 years old. I fell in love with Kiss. And then, progressively got harder, more interested in harder music as I got older, and just, started being a fan of Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Queensryche. I grew up in the 80s, so it was a lot of, metal was really popular or a little bit more mainstream. As I got older, I got really involved in kind of the extreme underground scene. And currently, I write about metal as, a portion of my living. So it was just, I gravitated towards it like everyone else in terms of, videos and music and just being really interested in the music. It wasn't until I was, 11 or 12 or 13 that I realized that, being a black girl, I wasn't supposed to be involved in this scene. And I was never just a casual listener. I've always been a bit of a nerd, so I always wanted to be a music journalist and actually write about these bands. So for me, it's always been kind of a serious thing in terms of, as an adult now, this is how I make a portion of my living.
And it's also a huge part of yourself. And you have a growing following of extremely passionate individuals and people who, when we're having this conversation, they might even wonder in the first place why the question is posited in the first place. We have a comment here from Rick. Can black people like heavy metal? What an incredibly silly question. I can't tell you the number of black, Indian, Spanish, etc. people at metal shows. It is the one music genre that accepts everyone. It is the only real music form. Well, Rick, we're tickled that you are a heavy metal fan, but Lena, I want to show viewers part of an interview that you gave earlier this year to show some insight on what it's like sometimes being someone who's asked, what are you doing here?
It's not fun, people staring at you all the time, like why are you here? I went to cover Metallica, at ACC in 2009, and that was just totally insane. I had guys making gorilla noises at me when I walked by. I had a couple of people call me the N-word.
Has anybody come up to you and straight up told you that this music is not for black people?
Oh, yeah, several times.
So here we have an art form that people absolutely love, people who love the art form, but yet you are put in positions where you're being told just because of who you are, you shouldn't be loving this. What's that all about?
Well, I think when people say like that comment, of course black people love heavy metal, and of course people from other ethnicities. It's about kind of entering spaces where in music genre cultures where it's predominantly white male fans and white women, and being placed in a situation where in some circumstances you do have to worry about your safety. You're dealing with the racism and in some ways sexism and misogyny that's happening in the outside world. So for when I wrote this book, I mean, part of it is a memoir, but what I really wanted to do too was to interview not only just black female metal fans, but also black female metal musicians. The picture here is of Militia from Judas Priestess and Vernon Reid from Living Colour. So people like Militia, industry workers, writers, journalists, people who are involved in the heavy metal, hardcore, and punk scenes to talk about their experiences being coded as the other. So of course there's lots of people that enjoy heavy metal, hardcore, and punk music. But I wanted to really investigate what is it like to be, quote unquote, the fly in the buttermilk, and how to navigate these scenes and how to get the best out of these scenes without being hindered and without, feeling so uncomfortable that even though you like this particular band, you're afraid of actually going to a show because you're afraid that you're going to get verbally or physically harassed. And unfortunately, I've met a lot of black women and men who don't go to heavy metal shows and who don't actively participate in the scene because they are worried about those stereotypes that really could affect how they, their enjoyment and their safety within these scenes.
And I think that is so important. That's why I'm glad we're having conversations like this, and I'm sure Dr. Martin can attest to the importance. We have a comment here from Rona Barrymore who echoes your sentiment. She says, when I went to a KISS concert as a teen, I was told you shouldn't be here. And we're talking about safety, we're talking about visibility, whether it's Gregory with his knitting, you with heavy metal music, or also Julie, I want to go to you because your website here, The Fat Girl's Guide to Running, when you're listening to your fellow panelists talk, I'm sure you see similarities, even though your hobbies are entirely different. What is it like to be a fat girl running?
It's really interesting that when people think about runners, they don't think about big people. You assume that a runner's going to be nice and slim and have muscles in all the right places, but actually there's lots of overweight people that enjoy the sport of running. And so I guess I like to shock people and surprise people by not just running as a hobby, but by doing big distances. So my favourite distance is the marathon because people don't think that I would be able to run that distance.
And when we're talking about the issue of safety, as it was mentioned by Lena, you have safety concerns yourself. What happened the very first time you decided to run? What happened to you?
It was a fun run. It was only 3 kilometres, and I was probably at my largest then, and some little kid shouted, "Hey, run, fatty, run," and all of his friends were laughing, and it made me feel really bad about myself. But it's not an isolated incident. I have men shout things out of cars, throw things at me. I've even had somebody slap me on my bottom as I run past.
So when we're listening to this, Dr. Martin, why is it that in each of these stories, each of these wonderful individuals who are out enjoying themselves, having a great time, why is it both ways? One, people don't want you doing things because you don't look like this, but also it just seems like you can't win either way. You can't win if you're doing the item, if you're not doing the item, especially in situations that people are just trying to have a good time. Why are people so averse to opening things up, to being more inclusive in their heads?
So in research terms, it's a pretty mixed picture, to be honest. So there's some evidence of positive reactions to counter stereotypic behaviour and quite a lot of evidence of negative reactions as well. And it seems that, in one sense, people have objections to things that don't meet their expectations, so things that are counter-stereotypic. But at the same time, in a positive sense, we also really like people who are unique individuals. So you probably saw that with Gregory, whereby those police officers, they, first of all, seem to react in a negative way. Something didn't meet their expectations, something's wrong here, and they want to understand the situation. They get chatting to them, and then they like the kind of uniqueness about them. So we do have both parts of the picture here. The other thing that's really important to note is that stereotypes are just the bits of information that are associated with the categories, and what a lot of these people are experiencing is prejudice, which is some people who believe that the stereotypes are accurate, basically.
Prejudice is such an important part of this. Julie, tell us about what happens when you go to the doctor. Obviously, you're healthy, you can run a marathon, but it's just not enough for some medical professionals.
So I went to the doctors and I had a back pain. It was completely unrelated to my running. And the first thing he said to me is, tell me about your weight. And I said, what do you want to know? And he basically said that I was too unfit to run the marathon. And I said to him, so what you mean is I'm too fat? And he nodded, and he said, yeah, basically you're too fat to run the marathon. And I was furious, and I went on and I ran that marathon just to prove him wrong. Because how dare he make that assumption based on just how I look?
It's ridiculous and obviously not true for you and your fan club. I mean, you just have all of these women who are defying these stereotypes. Here's the thing, we can talk all day long about the negative aspects of it. As we see with Julie's crew, one of the positive aspects of being other is you invite others to be other like you until maybe you become a majority, or if not a large minority. Lena, what are some positives you've experienced by being one of the few minorities in the crowd at the heavy metal concert?
At the heavy metal concert, there's not too many benefits.
Okay, what?
Okay, so let's no, but the best thing for me in terms of writing this book is really building a community, especially on Facebook. I've met so many women fans who are across the world who are really into heavy metal, hardcore, and punk. I've made personal friends because of this community, and in addition, I've learned about so many young Black women who are in metal bands, in hardcore punk bands, and it's been really awesome to hear their music and to try and promote them as much as possible. So really building a community, and I think what's really important is, I tell people this, and sometimes I don't think they really quite understand how important it is to find people who have been through these same experiences. There's, people tell me things about things they've experienced at shows that they cannot tell their white friends or their non-Black metal friends. They experience, microaggressions and a lot of passive aggressive behavior that they don't feel comfortable talking to their friends about. So they need that community of other Black women to really kind of talk about not only what they went through, but basically what are the best ways to combat it. And I think in terms of safety, it's also important to build a community. So if you can introduce, two people that live in the same city and they want to go see, Paul Bearer or, Metallica or whatever, and the show's coming to town, hook those people up, and then they have a friend to go to, and they feel a little bit more comfortable and safe within these environments.
Now I want to go see Paul Bearer. I think we can have fun together.
But here's an album coming out in August, so everybody check out the new Paul Bearer album. It's awesome.
All right, we'll hook it up. Here's your awesome Facebook page right here. I just love the cover picture right here. It makes me so happy. But Gregory, I gotta say, you said you were homeless. You were knitting the teddy bears. Did the teddy bears really get you out of homelessness?
Yeah, well, yeah, people, that was the initial thing was, I sold one and it was enough to buy something to eat, and it sold in a matter of minutes, and I was like, I think I'm onto something here. Like I said, the fact that people saw what looked like a guy who eats boiled peanuts and watches NASCAR whip out his knitting needles and make this delicate little teddy bear, people were like, I've got to have one. And then I started writing about the whole situation, and it started bringing more and more people towards me, and it's been a blessing. It really has been. Being a stereotype has actually been a blessing, so to speak. If I didn't look like a redneck, if I looked like a hipster, I don't think I would have gotten nearly as much attention.
Well, I'm tickled that you look the way you do and are doing what you're doing. Your website's here, Madman Knitting. More information on each of our guests and Dr. Martin's fabulous resources and research is in our resource well underneath this video screen. So check that out. Make sure you stay tuned because the conversation always continues here at HuffPost Live.